In the depths of ancient China's mythological past, before the great dynasties rose and fell, before written history began to record the deeds of emperors and the movements of armies, there existed a time of chaos and catastrophe. The waters had risen, the rivers had broken their banks. Floods covered the land, drowning villages, destroying farmland, and forcing humanity to retreat to the highest ground they could find. The world was drowning, and civilization itself hung by a thread. Into this desperate situation stepped a man whose determination, innovation, and sacrifice would become the foundation of Chinese political legitimacy for thousands of years. His name was Yu, and his struggle against the Great Flood would transform him from an engineer into a legend, from a servant of the people into the founder of China's first dynasty. This is the story of Yu the Great, the man who tamed the floods, and in doing so created the template for what Chinese rulers were supposed to be. To understand the significance of Yu's story, we must first understand the world that existed before him, a world where the relationship between humanity and nature was precarious, and where survival itself was never guaranteed. Ancient China, like all ancient civilizations, was fundamentally shaped by geography and climate. The great river systems, the Yellow River in the north and the Yangtze River in the south, were both the source of life and the source of death. When the rivers flowed within their banks, they provided water for irrigation, transportation for goods and people, and fertile soil deposited by seasonal flooding. But when the rivers broke free of their natural channels, when the rains came too heavily or the snowmelt in the distant mountains was too great, the waters would surge across the landscape with devastating force. The floods that Yu would confront were not merely natural disasters in the modern sense. They were existential catastrophes that threatened the very survival of human communities. Without modern technology, without the engineering knowledge that later civilizations would develop, without even basic tools beyond stone and wood and human muscle, ancient peoples were largely helpless before the power of water and flood. Villages that had stood for generations could be swept away in hours. Farmland that families had cultivated for years could be buried under silt or transformed into useless marsh. People could drown in their own homes, or they could survive the initial flood only to die slowly of starvation as their crops rotted and their livestock perished. It was in this context of repeated catastrophe, of floods that came again and again, that the legend of Yu emerged. The story begins not with Yu himself but with his father, Gun. According to the ancient texts, Gun was appointed by the legendary Emperor Yao to address the flood problem that was devastating the land. Gun approached the problem in what seemed like a logical way. He attempted to contain the floods through the construction of dams and levees. Gun's strategy was to build barriers that would hold back the water, to create walls that would prevent the rivers from overflowing their banks. For 9 years, Gun worked on this approach, marshaling labor and resources to build these protective barriers across the landscape. But Gun's approach failed. The dams and levees he constructed could not withstand the power of the waters. The floods broke through the barriers, often with even more devastating force than before, because the temporary containment had allowed water to build up behind the dams until the pressure became overwhelming. Gun's failure was not merely a technical setback, it was perceived as a moral and political failure. In the cosmology of ancient China, natural disasters were often interpreted as signs of cosmic imbalance, as indications that the relationship between heaven and earth had gone wrong. Gun's inability to solve the flood problem was seen as evidence that he lacked the virtue or the wisdom necessary for such an important task. The consequences for Gun were severe. According to different versions of the legend, Gun was either executed or banished for his failure. Some accounts say he was killed by the Emperor Shun, who had succeeded Yao. Other versions suggest that Gun transformed into various creatures, or that he died in exile. But all versions agree on one crucial point. Gun's failure created the opportunity and the necessity for his son Yu to attempt what his father could not accomplish. Yu inherited not just his father's mission, but also the knowledge of his father's failure. Yu understood that the approach Gun had taken attempting to contain and block the floods had not worked. This understanding forced Yu to think differently about the problem. If blocking the water had failed, perhaps the solution was not to fight against the water's power, but rather to work with it, to guide it, to channel it in ways that would serve human needs rather than destroy human communities. This insight, this fundamental shift in approach, would become the foundation of Yu's success. Yu's strategy was based on understanding the nature of water itself. Water flows downhill. Water seeks the lowest point. Water will follow the path of least resistance. These simple observations led Yu to a revolutionary conclusion. Instead of trying to stop the floods with barriers, he would create channels that would direct the floodwaters where they needed to go. He would dig canals and dredge rivers to create pathways that would carry excess water away from populated areas and farmland. He would lower the beds of existing rivers so they could carry more water without overflowing. He would create a system of water management that worked with nature's principles rather than trying to oppose them through brute force. The practical implementation of this strategy was monumentally difficult. Yu had to survey vast territories to understand the topography, to identify where water was flowing and where it needed to flow instead. He had to organize massive labor forces to dig the canals and channels that would redirect the floods. He had to coordinate work across regions and ensure that the channels in one area connected properly with channels in another area. He had to maintain the morale and the commitment of workers who were engaged in backbreaking labor with no guarantee that their efforts would succeed. The legends tell us that Yu worked with such dedication that he passed by his own home 3 times without entering, even though he could hear his children crying inside. This detail, whether literally true or symbolic, captures something important about how Yu's story was understood. He was a man who put public duty above personal comfort, who sacrificed his own family life for the welfare of the broader community. This theme of selfless service would become central to how Chinese political culture understood legitimate rulership. Yu's work took 13 years, according to the traditional accounts. For 13 years, he traveled through the land, surveying rivers and mountains, organizing labor gangs, supervising the digging of channels and the dredging of rivers. The scale of the undertaking was staggering. Yu was not working on a single river or a single region, but attempting to manage water flow across an entire civilization's territory. He was coordinating efforts that required thousands of workers in dozens of different locations, all working toward a common goal that none of them might live to see fully realized. The legends attribute almost superhuman capabilities to Yu. Some versions of the story suggest that Yu could transform into a bear to move massive rocks and dig through mountains. Other accounts describe him as having magical helpers, dragons, or divine beings who assisted in the most difficult aspects of the work. These supernatural elements should not be dismissed as mere fantasy. They represent the ancient storyteller's attempt to convey something true about Yu's achievement, that what he accomplished seemed impossible by ordinary human standards, that it required capabilities beyond what any normal person could possess. But beneath the supernatural embellishments, there was a core of practical engineering achievement. Yu and his workers really did dig canals. They really did dredge rivers and lower riverbeds. They really did create drainage systems that channeled water away from populated areas. The physical evidence of ancient hydraulic engineering in China suggests that significant water management projects were indeed undertaken in the distant past, even if the specific details have been lost or embellished by legend. As Yu's work progressed, the floods began to recede. The waters that had covered the land started to drain away through the channels Yu had created. Land that had been submerged for years became dry and could be cultivated again. Villages that had been abandoned because of flooding could be reoccupied. The agricultural foundation of Chinese civilization could be rebuilt. The success of Yu's approach vindicated his strategy. Working with water's nature, rather than trying to oppose it, had proven to be the correct approach. The success of the flood control project had profound political consequences. Emperor Shun, recognizing Yu's extraordinary achievement and his demonstration of the virtues necessary for leadership, designated Yu as his successor. This was a remarkable decision. In later Chinese history, succession would typically pass from father to son within ruling families. But in this earlier, more fluid period, succession was based on demonstrated merit and virtue. Shun chose Yu not because of Yu's family connections. Indeed, Yu's father Gun had failed and been punished, but because Yu had proven through his actions that he possessed the qualities necessary to rule. When Yu became emperor, he established what traditional Chinese historiography recognizes as the Xia dynasty, the first dynasty in Chinese history. The historicity of the Xia dynasty has been debated by scholars. Archaeological evidence for it is limited and ambiguous. But whether or not the Xia dynasty existed in exactly the form described in ancient texts, the legend of Yu and the Xia dynasty served crucial functions in how Chinese civilization understood political legitimacy. Yu's story established several principles that would shape Chinese political thought for millennia. First, it established that legitimate rulership was based on service to the people and on the ability to solve the practical problems that threatened the community's survival. Yu became emperor not because he conquered others through military force or because he was born into the right family, but because he had served the people effectively by taming the floods. This principle that rulers should be evaluated based on their service to the people's welfare became fundamental to Confucian political philosophy. Second, Yu's story established that legitimate rulers needed to possess both moral virtue and practical capability. Yu was virtuous in his selfless dedication, passing by his home without entering, sacrificing personal comfort for public duty. But he was also practically capable. He understood engineering principles. He could organize large-scale projects. He could solve complex technical problems. This combination of moral virtue and practical effectiveness became the ideal for Chinese rulership. Third, Yu's story established a particular relationship between the ruler and natural forces. Yu succeeded not by dominating nature through superior force, but by understanding nature's principles and working with them. This suggested that good governance required wisdom and understanding rather than mere power, that the effective ruler needed to comprehend the fundamental patterns of how things worked, and to align human society with those patterns rather than trying to impose human will against natural principles. The legend of Yu also became intertwined with concepts of territorial unity and political legitimacy. Yu's travels throughout the land to manage the floods became symbolically associated with the unification of Chinese territory. The 9 provinces that Yu supposedly established through his flood control work became a template for understanding China's political geography. The idea that China was naturally unified, that it should be governed as a single political entity, was reinforced by the story of Yu's comprehensive management of water systems that crossed regional boundaries. In later periods, when Chinese dynasties needed to justify their rule, they would often invoke the precedent of Yu. They would claim to be following in Yu's tradition of service to the people. They would undertake hydraulic engineering projects, building canals, managing rivers, constructing irrigation systems partly for practical reasons, but also to demonstrate that they were acting in the tradition of Yu the Great. The management of water systems became not just an engineering challenge, but a political statement about the ruler's legitimacy and virtue. The legend of Yu was also significant for what it said about the relationship between knowledge and power. Yu succeeded where his father had failed, because Yu understood something Gun did not, that water must be channeled rather than blocked. This suggested that effective governance required wisdom and understanding, that rulers needed to comprehend the nature of the problems they faced, rather than simply applying force or following conventional approaches. The intellectual content of rulership The ability to analyze problems, to develop innovative solutions, to learn from failure was emphasized through Yu's story. Yu's achievement was also presented as fundamentally communal rather than individual. Although Yu was the leader and the strategist, the actual work of taming the floods required the coordinated labor of countless people digging channels, moving earth, dredging rivers. Yu's genius was not just in understanding what needed to be done, but in organizing the collective effort necessary to accomplish it. This emphasis on coordinated collective action under wise leadership became part of how Chinese political culture understood major undertakings. The legend underwent various elaborations and interpretations over the centuries. Confucian scholars emphasized Yu's moral virtue and his selfless service. Taoist thinkers focused on Yu's understanding of natural principles and his wisdom in working with rather than against nature's patterns. Legalist theorists noted Yu's organizational capabilities and his ability to mobilize resources for state purposes. Different schools of thought found different lessons in Yu's story, but all agreed on its fundamental importance to understanding Chinese political culture. The historical reality behind the legend of Yu is difficult to establish with certainty. Modern archaeology has found evidence of significant flooding in ancient China and evidence of early hydraulic engineering projects. Some scholars suggest that Yu might represent not a single individual, but rather a tradition of flood control efforts undertaken over generations and then compressed into a single legendary figure. Others argue that there may indeed have been a historical individual whose achievements were then embellished and mythologized over time. But in an important sense, the question of historical accuracy misses the point of Yu's significance. Whether or not every detail of the legend is factually true, the story of Yu the Great performed crucial cultural work for Chinese civilization. It provided a founding narrative that explained where legitimate political authority came from and what it was supposed to accomplish. It established ideals for rulership that would shape Chinese political culture for thousands of years. It created a template for understanding the relationship between rulers and ruled, between human society and natural forces, between individual virtue and collective welfare. The story of Yu also spoke to something universal about human experience with natural disasters and about the human drive to overcome environmental challenges. Every civilization has faced floods, droughts, earthquakes, and other natural catastrophes. Every civilization has developed stories about heroes who protected the community from these threats. Yu's story is the Chinese version of this universal human narrative, but it's a version that emphasizes particular values: patience over immediate action, wisdom over brute force, service over personal ambition, working with nature rather than trying to dominate it. The legend's emphasis on Yu's 13 years of continuous effort, on his passing by his home without entering, on his willingness to endure personal hardship for public benefit, these elements resonated deeply with a culture that valued patience, perseverance, and the subordination of personal desires to collective needs. Yu became a model not just for rulers, but for anyone undertaking difficult, long-term projects that required sustained commitment despite personal cost. Yu's approach to the flood's channeling, rather than blocking, also became a metaphor that extended far beyond hydraulic engineering. It suggested a broader philosophy about how to address problems. Rather than trying to suppress or eliminate forces that were causing difficulties, perhaps the better approach was to redirect those forces toward constructive purposes. This principle could be applied to social tensions, to economic challenges, to diplomatic conflicts. The idea of working with existing forces, rather than trying to eliminate them, became part of Chinese strategic thinking across many domains. The establishment of the Xia dynasty by Yu also marked a transition in Chinese legendary history, from the age of the sage emperors Yao, Shun, and Yu himself, to the age of hereditary dynasties. Yu initially followed the precedent of his predecessors by planning to pass power to the most worthy successor, But Yu's son Qi seized power after Yu's death, establishing the hereditary principle that would characterize most of subsequent Chinese history. This transition was viewed with ambivalence in Chinese political thought. The sage emperor model, where succession went to the most virtuous and capable, was considered more idealistic, but the hereditary model was more stable and became the norm. The legend of Yu the Great also connected with Chinese conceptions of the relationship between civilization and wilderness. Before Yu tamed the floods, much of the land was uninhabitable, covered by water, overgrown with reeds and marshes, dangerous and chaotic. Yu's work transformed this chaotic wilderness into ordered, cultivated, civilized space where human communities could flourish. This narrative of bringing order from chaos, of creating civilization from wilderness through human effort and ingenuity, became central to how Chinese culture understood its own development. The figure of Yu appeared throughout Chinese literature, philosophy, and art. Confucius reportedly praised Yu for his frugality and his dedication to public service. Mencius cited Yu as an example of the kind of moral ruler who genuinely cared for the people's welfare. Historical texts used Yu as a standard against which to judge contemporary rulers. Did they measure up to Yu's dedication? Were they serving the people as selflessly as Yu had served? Artists depicted Yu in various poses, surveying the land, directing workers, or in his legendary transformation into a bear. Yu became an icon whose image carried immediate meaning about proper rulership and virtuous service. The legend also addressed questions about innovation and tradition. Gun had followed traditional approaches to flood control, building dams and levees to block water. Yu innovated by doing something different, channeling the water instead of blocking it. Yet Yu was not presented as a revolutionary who rejected tradition entirely. Instead, he was shown as someone who learned from his father's failure, who understood why the traditional approach hadn't worked, and who developed a better solution based on deeper understanding. This nuanced view of innovation, not rejecting tradition outright, but learning from it and building upon it, became characteristic of Chinese approaches to change and reform. Yu's 13-year campaign against the floods also established a template for understanding major state projects. Significant undertakings, building canals, constructing defensive walls, organizing irrigation systems, were understood to require sustained effort over many years, to require the coordination of vast labor forces, and to require leadership that could maintain focus and commitment despite setbacks and challenges. Later, emperors who undertook major infrastructure projects would often invoke Yu's precedent, suggesting that they were following in the tradition of the great flood tamer. The geographic knowledge that Yu supposedly gained through his travels, understanding the topography of the land, knowing where rivers flowed and mountains stood, was also significant. This comprehensive knowledge of the territory became associated with the right to rule that territory. Yu knew the land thoroughly because he had traveled through it, worked in it, shaped it through his flood control efforts. This knowledge gave him authority over it. Later, rulers would similarly emphasize their knowledge of and connection to the territories they governed. In the cosmic order that ancient Chinese thought described, Yu occupied a crucial mediating position. He stood between heaven and earth, between the divine realm that sent the floods and the human realm that suffered from them. His success in taming the floods demonstrated that humans were not entirely helpless before natural forces, that through wisdom, effort, and proper understanding, humanity could shape its environment and create the conditions for civilization to flourish. Yet Yu's success was not presented as humanity conquering nature, but rather as humanity learning to work harmoniously with nature's principles. The legend of Yu the Great has endured for more than 3,000 years because it speaks to enduring concerns and values. It addresses the relationship between leaders and those they lead, suggesting that legitimate authority comes from service rather than from force. It addresses humanity's relationship with nature, suggesting that wisdom and understanding matter more than brute strength. It addresses questions of persistence and dedication, showing that significant achievements require sustained effort over long periods. And it addresses the fundamental question of what makes a good society, not wealth or power in themselves, but the ability to solve the practical problems that threaten people's survival and well-being. Whether Yu was a historical individual, a composite of multiple figures, or an entirely legendary creation, the story attributed to him became one of the foundation narratives of Chinese civilization. It provided a model for understanding political legitimacy that would influence Chinese thought throughout the imperial period and even into modern times. The principle that rulers should be evaluated based on their service to the people's welfare, that they should possess both moral virtue and practical capability, that they should work to solve the real problems facing society. These principles traced back to the legend of Yu the Great. In the modern era, as China has grappled with questions of governance, development, and its relationship with both its past and with nature, the legend of Yu has remained relevant. Major infrastructure projects, flood control systems, dams, canals, are still undertaken with an awareness of this ancient tradition. The tension between controlling nature and working with nature, between immediate action and patient long-term effort, between individual vision and collective labor. These tensions that appear in Yu's legend remain relevant to contemporary challenges. The story of Yu the Great reminds us that the foundational narratives of civilizations often center not on conquest or domination, but on service and problem-solving. Yu became great not by defeating human enemies, but by addressing the natural catastrophe that threatened his community. He became a legitimate ruler not by seizing power, but by earning the people's trust through effective service. These principles that greatness comes from service, that legitimacy comes from solving real problems, that effective leadership requires both virtue and capability. These were the gifts that the legend of Yu the Great gave to Chinese political culture. And they remain as relevant today as they were 3,000 years ago, when the story first began to take shape in the collective memory of an ancient people learning how to live with their rivers and their floods.